Hey everybody, here we are again. Pastor Levi's Sunday school class here. We're going to be covering Acts chapter 25 this morning. Largely, it's a continuation of where we've been here for the last several chapters in dealing with Paul being on trial in various ways, making the same arguments against him and the same arguments he makes in defense of himself. So let's go ahead and we'll jump into this where we've been in this section so far. Paul was attacked at the temple, if you remember, in Jerusalem. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But a group of Jews from Asia saw him, accused him of profaning the temple, bringing a Gentile in to the areas where he was not allowed. Of course, this isn't true. But then Paul is rescued by a tribune, a Roman tribune, and the soldiers, and he leverages his citizenship at that point to make sure that he isn't beaten and isn't put on trial in an unfair way. He's originally then the next day brought before the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin there. And Paul uses a clever political tactic there to turn the Pharisees and the Sadducees against one another by pointing out that the real reason why he's not liked is that the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. So that gets all of the Pharisees, even though they don't like Paul, to be on Paul's side, at least for the moment. So the tribune then has to rescue him yet again. It's then that after the Sanhedrin gathers themselves that they request that the Roman tribune send him back to them to be examined yet again. And their plan was they had 40 individuals who took an oath to not eat nor drink until Paul was killed, and that as Paul would be transported to them to be examined again, that they would kill him. Word gets to Paul and the tribune about this, so Paul is then sent off to the governor in Caesarea, named Felix. So then Paul goes on trial before Felix, and the Sanhedrin sends some representatives down to conduct that trial. And Felix can't find anything wrong that Paul did. That's pretty much the gist of it. But Felix is a very corrupt individual, and he will not allow Paul to go free. Paul preaches the gospel to Felix and puts his thumb right on the pressure point with Felix, too, about his lack of righteousness in ruling his people and his own sexual immorality. But Felix won't be moved, and eventually Felix then gets removed. So that's where we're going to pick up the story here today, is with Felix having left and he being replaced by a new governor named Festus. That's going to be in the first 5 verses here of Acts 25. So I'll go ahead and read that to you here, and we'll break it apart and see what's going on. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, he said, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. So Festus is new on the scene here, and our big idea here is that God controls world events to fulfill his promises. So you remember, right after he was beaten by the crowd and the mob, and after he leveraged his citizenship with the tribune, Jesus appears to Paul and he tells him, you're not going to die here. You're going to make it all the way to Rome to testify about me, even, we believe, before Caesar. So, after that promise, throughout the story here, we've got all these threats to that promise, specifically from the Jews and the Roman leaders here. And what we see here is God working these events behind the scenes and bringing about fulfillment of the promises that he gave to Paul. So that's the big idea here. We get first here that Festus arrives, and Festus replaces Felix. So Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us a little bit of the background about Felix. Felix was summoned back to Rome to go before, Nero, because of the brutality of his rule. So if you think back to how the Sanhedrin addressed Felix as this great and righteous ruler, it's just a bunch of hogwash. It's nonsense. He's a total wretched individual. And he's so wretched that his brutality, he was brutal even by Roman standards as an occupying force. So that's pretty bad there. He was reportedly brought before Nero, as it were, and he was only saved because his brother Pallas appealed to Nero. So he was only saved from being punished himself for how terrible a ruler he was because he had connections. So Festus comes in, and his reputation, though he only ruled for 2 years in that area, was that he was a much more moderate and just ruler, but he still leaves much to be desired by the standards of Scripture. So he only lasted 2 years, then he died while in office. But through all of this, as I said, God is moving the chessboard pieces to accomplish his will and fulfill his promises to Paul, or his promise to Paul. So, right as he arrives then in Jerusalem to see what's going on, the Jewish leaders are back at square one with a new ruler, so they had decided to try the same tactics. They say, hey, we want you, as a favor to us, you're new here, you want to have the goodwill of the Jewish people, so as a favor to us, you need to send that Paul up to Jerusalem so that we can put him on trial here. And they're going to try the same plan that they were trying before, is that along the way they're going to have him killed. Okay, now this puts Festus in an interesting situation because he's the new ruler, but he doesn't want to be told what to do by his subjects, right? So there's some politicking going on here, and he basically tells them, no, I ain't going to do that. I'm going down to Caesarea. You're free to come with me down to Caesarea, and you can bring any formal charges you have against him at that time. And of course, that was what the Roman law was, is if you have charges against the individual, you need to bring them through the proper channels. So Paul is here in the short term saved yet again from the schemes of the Jewish leaders. And at least at first blush here, Festus does a little bit better than Felix did. So Paul is saved and from the hatred of the Jews yet again. Real quick section there. And again, chapter 25, we're really not covering a whole lot of new ground here at this point in the story. Chapter 26, we'll get in front of Paul's trial before Festus and Agrippa, which is the longest account of any of Paul's trials. So there's some new information to be gleaned here. But chapter 25 is really, we're kind of stuck in the same cycle here in these chapters. All right, so Paul is now he is going to do something a little bit new here, is he's going to appeal to Caesar in verses 6 through 12 in this next trial. So let's go ahead and read that section here. 6. And after he stayed among them, not more than 8 or 10 days, that's Festus in Jerusalem, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?" But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed, and to Caesar you shall go." Our big idea here is something we've seen Paul do throughout. It's not wrong for Christians to appeal to their earthly rights. So he did this when the tribune first arrested him and saved him from the mob. He asserted his Roman citizenship. And here he's going to do it again with Festus here as right as a Roman citizen to appeal his case to the highest law of the land, who is, of course, Caesar. So our big idea, our point here is, as we work throughout this section in verses 6 through 7, Paul's on trial here yet again. Same thing. I mean, this is really an abbreviated summary of what happened here. So a group of Jews come down to Caesarea from Jerusalem, and they bring the same charges again. They probably tried to add some new things, some new twists and turns about it. We don't get the details here from Luke as to what particular charges they brought this time, which probably means they're about the same as before. And as Paul offers his defense, which again it's an abbreviated defense in this section, we see that they're pretty much the same charges. So in the first two, as we see breaking the Jewish law and profaning the temple, are really religious charges. It's really nothing that the court of Caesar is going to be interested in whatsoever. It's the third one, in the betrayal of Caesar, that really is the one that would draw Festus's attention and his possible judgment. So Paul's defense in verses 8 through 10 is really more of the same. He says, I didn't break the Jewish law. I didn't profane the temple. I didn't bring a Gentile into the temple courts where I shouldn't have. I was there being purified, showing that I was obeying those laws. Moreover, my belief system in Christianity is not a rejection of the law, but the fulfillment of what the law was looking forward to. So he's pointing out here to Festus that this is a religious dispute. This is not something that Caesar needs to concern himself with. And then finally he says, I did not betray Caesar. He makes it clear that I am not trying to start an insurrection. I'm not trying to dethrone Caesar. And I have not cast any disrepute upon him. So there's really nothing to any of these charges that have been brought before me. And he goes so far as to even say to Festus, you know that there isn't any substance to these charges. And I'm a Roman citizen. So that's what leads us to what he's going to do here with appealing to Caesar. But before he gets to that, the first half of verse 11 is telling. And that's Paul's submission to justice. Paul makes this interesting statement after asserting his innocence. He says, if I have done anything worthy to deserve death, then go ahead and kill me. If it is just and righteous for you to punish me for these crimes, then I will make no defense whatsoever. Go ahead and punish me. And that's an attitude that Christians really should have. If I've broken the law, then I'm okay with paying the punishment for that law. But Paul's point entirely here is that I haven't done that. I haven't broken the law. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing punishable about anything that I've done here. So that leads him to see, he's got a good understanding of what's going on here. This leads him to see that as Festus asks him, well, how about then we bring you down to Jerusalem so you can go on trial there? And Paul sees right through this. Paul knows that he's trying to do the Jews a favor. He's not really interested in justice. So while he may be better than Felix in some regards, he's really just as corrupt and wicked as any of them. So he says, well, since I'm innocent and since this court isn't really interested in that, I appeal to Caesar. Let's look at verse 11 again. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. Again, showing his confidence in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Death is not something he fears. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. That's his point. I'm a Roman citizen. This is a Roman court. I'm on trial where I should be. These Jews and their commands against me, or their charges against me of breaking Jewish laws, have no standing in this court. They don't have a standing, and you have no right, as me being a Roman citizen, for you to hand me over to them. But because Paul sees what's going on here, that he wants to do the people he is going to rule over, he wants to do them a favor, that he then appeals to Caesar. I appeal to Caesar, which was, again, a right of a Roman citizen. If he felt like he was not getting a fair trial, I mean, to be a Roman citizen was to have privileges that most of the people who lived under Roman rule did not have. And Paul is not afraid to use those privileges. And he says, I'm going to Caesar. I don't trust you. I'm going to appeal to Caesar, which of course puts Festus in a bit of a dilemma. Okay? So he turns to his advisors. He's new to this job. The man who just left the job was called back to Rome because he was corrupt and brutal. So, I mean, there's a bit of a microscope here on Festus. And there's a Roman citizen here being charged by subjects to Rome with flimsy to no evidence. And Paul says, I'm going to bring this in front of your boss. Right? So Festus's dilemma here is pretty stark. Is how should a Roman citizen should not be being treated the way that he is. But if he were to just release Paul, so here's the dilemma, the Jews could start an uprising and could start a riot, which will, again, make him look bad before Rome, right? It's his job to keep the peace there, to keep the people in subject to him. So he can either send this guy off to Rome, which could make him look bad, or not send him off to Rome, which could end up making him look bad in a different way. So in the end, Festus seems to view this as a way out, to wash his hands of the situation and to say, hey, I'm going to send this guy along to Caesar, and Caesar can deal with him. Then it's not going to be my fault. So that's where this section ends here. And that leads us to our final section here. Chapter 25, as I said, not a lot of new ground here, so it's not going to be as much time here this morning in covering it. So let's go ahead and look at the politics of Festus here in the last and biggest section here that really sets up the trial in chapter 26, verses 13 through 27. Now, when some days had passed, Agrippa, the king, and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man left prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face, and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charges laid before him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in this case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion, about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these charges, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death, and as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore I have brought him before you all, especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after you have examined him, I may have something to write, for it seems to me unreasonable sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. All right, so our big idea here is that the courts of men are often disinterested in truth and justice, and this is really something that has been true throughout most of world history. And while our court systems today are far from perfect, they are, when you take a look at the history of the world, some of the best we've ever had. And we should be grateful for that, but we should still understand that as Christians, that men are wicked, the systems of men are tainted by our wickedness, and they often don't bring about true justice in this life. So let's break this down here. The arrival of Agrippa and Bernice. So we've been dealing with the Herods for quite some time throughout the New Testament. Okay, so King Agrippa II here is the son of King Agrippa I, who died in, I think it was Acts chapter 12. He dies. So here's his son, and he comes with his sister Bernice. All right, and King Agrippa II is the great grandson of Herod the Great, who was, of course, king during the birth of Jesus. So he was also, the King Agrippa II is also the grandnephew of Herod Antipas, King Herod Antipas, who was the king who arrested and killed John the Baptist in the Gospels. So the Herod family has some Jewish roots, and they rule over on behest of Rome at this time. And so here he's able to offer some help to Festus, because Festus probably doesn't know much about Judaism. Herod Agrippa does. And what we also know about Herod and his sister, Bernice, who arrive here, is that it was widely rumored and believed that they had an incestuous relationship. So while there's some Jewish roots in them, they are not righteous individuals by any stretch of the word. So Festus has Agrippa there, and he gives him a defense of all of his actions and what he's done. He says, Felix left this guy here. The Jews wanted him killed, so I put him on trial according to the Jewish law. I said, hey, this guy can't be put on trial without facing his accusers, and or according to Roman law, we can't do these things. So we have this, and then as I'm on trial here, it's clear to me that they only are really having religious disputes here, right? So Festus admits, as far as Roman law is concerned, I've got no reason here to keep this guy in prison, none whatsoever. But that's not what he said to Paul. He wanted to bring Paul to be put on trial. Here, and he even admits that to Agrippa that, hey, I've got no reason here, but hey, how about we put you on trial anyways? Right, there's no standing here, but why don't we put you on trial anyways? Because all the Jews want you dead. So, I mean, there's really, this is a classic nonsense here by Festus. So Festus's implied request in verses 20 through 22, but being at a loss, he says, despite all this, and their debate over Jesus being alive or not, he says, I'm at a loss at how to investigate these questions. I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding him. But when Paul appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. So the implied question here, his implied request is, hey, Agrippa, can you help me out here? I'm new to the area. I don't really understand these religious disputes. Can you help me figure out what's going on here? And Agrippa says, yeah, I'd like to hear him. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what's going on here. I'm sure Agrippa's got a good understanding of the way or Christianity and the Judaism and what happened with Jesus. So he wants to hear Paul for himself, him and Bernice. So they set up a trial for the next day. And you got to love the imagery offered here by Luke. Luke is almost certainly there for this trial because this is the longest, most detailed trial we have of Paul here. So Luke is probably working from his own observations here. And look at his description here in 23. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp. They came, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. And at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. So as you come in here, Paul, the lowly prisoner, probably coming in rags and in chains, is going to be brought in front of all these guys who come in with the great pomp and circumstance of being the who's who, the powerful, the elite, as it were. You can see their pride and their pomp and their circumstance. And then Festus comes in and he says, hey, prominent men of the city, this is why we are here. I didn't think it was wise that we should send Paul to go before my boss, Caesar, my lord, with no charges before him. Again, he's admitting, I don't have any charges for this man that are worthy of him going before Caesar. In other words, I don't have any charges for this man to be on trial, but I'm not going to let him go. All right, so that's Festus's admission here. And then you have his pretense in verse 26. I have nothing definite to write, my lord. Therefore, I brought him before you all, especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I might have something to write. For it seems unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. So his pretense is we're here because we need to find out more because I have to tell Caesar something about him. So there's this pretense of him being fair and even-handed. Even though if he was fair and even-handed at this point, he would have to say there is no basis for the charges against him, and he should go free. So that sets us up for the trial that's going to happen. We'll cover again next week. Here, so how do we put this together? How do we put a bow on this and apply it to ourselves? Well, let's talk a little bit of theology and practice here. We're going to tie some of these things together. Okay, so first, trusting the goodness and the sovereignty of God. So when you look at Paul's situation, and then we look at our situation, we can be tempted to ask the question, what is God doing? Whether it's this pandemic or you're dealing with personal issues, we are people who believe in the sovereignty of God, that he directs all events for the good of his people. Right? And we believe in the goodness of God, that he loves us, and he is, again, doing these things for the good of his people. But then we face the problems of our day-to-day lives, and we go, what is going on here? Right? So throughout this whole book and chapter, we see that, and really throughout the entire Bible, we see that God is working out the big events of world history and the little events of world history to bring about the fulfillment of his plan, to bring about the fulfillment of his promises, to bring about the good of his people. So even though it may seem unpleasant in the present, the acts of faith of Christians is to trust in the goodness of God, that he is doing what is good and what is right and what is holy, and his sovereignty. That nothing that happens in your life is meaningless. Nothing happens by random happenstance or chance. It is all directed by God for his purposes and for our good. And that should be a comforting thought. That should give us courage. That should give us comfort in the chaos of our own day. Our second thing is that Christians must have proper expectations of human means. And so here in particular, we talk about human courts. So human courts are flawed. They can't know all. They can't rectify all wrongs. Right? So we see here the corruption of the Roman courts. We know that sometimes today we still have corrupt politicians, corrupt judges who are doing things for their own good and for their own ideological bents and their own agendas. And as Christians, we need to have the proper expectations of our rulers, right? That they are flawed individuals just like we are. So we can't go to the government, we can't go to the state or even the judges and demand a perfect justice. It's not going to happen this side of Christ's return. And in fact, even when the courts get it right and they imprison the rapist or the murderer, it still doesn't do complete and total justice. That will never happen until the judgment day, and when Christ comes and judges the living and the dead. Right? So justice ultimately and finally will come through God. He does bring some justice through the courts and through the governments of men now, but that justice is but a faint picture of what we long for. Third, we must be aware of political spin, and I don't think I could stress that enough in today's world. Everything in our world today in America is ripped apart between the two parties, right? Everything is hyper politicized, and unfortunately, that's even true of this pandemic. Everybody's trying to spin it to their own ends, to their own agenda, to their own narrative, as it were. And as Christians, we must be aware of that spin and not be people who get caught up in it. So one of the things I had found frustrating in life, even before this pandemic, but especially in this pandemic, has been my inability to get news that is even attempts to be unbiased. Whether it's CNN, MSNBC, or even Fox News, you know that they're spinning it in one direction or the other. And if you listen to the reports on the same event from the two different things, it's just completely different. Now, being conservative by conviction, I think Fox News and company tends to be a little closer to reality, but I know that they too are offering me some spin. So as Christians, we have to recognize that spin and try to cut through it, right? That the Christians should be concerned with truth, and we don't want to become the political tools of anybody. And I fear, maybe fear is not the right word. I know I'm watching this go on in our public life as I'm walking around, that people are sheep, and they are being steered right now, and steered in wretched ways by individuals, and people are feeding on the fear of individuals for their own profit gain and status, and that is wretched and wicked in all kinds of ways. And Christians, we need to not be partaking in that kind of nonsense. And then the fourth thing we can bring home here is the idea of remembering our rights. So here's Paul again, using his earthly rights, his political rights, for his own good and for his own gain. So we've talked about this several times in the book of Acts. It behooves us to remember that sometimes Christians should forego their rights, especially to benefit others. And sometimes we should assert our rights to bring about justice and righteousness and whatnot. And it takes a lot bit of wisdom to know when to do that. I think in particular, in general, when it comes to human relationships, especially when it comes to things like marriage, if you're constantly asserting your right over and against your spouse, that's no way to live in a Christian marriage. That's going to bring death and whatnot. As Christians, we should be willing to consider the good of others first. But when we're talking about politics and legal proceedings, it is good and right to assert rights to bring about justice, because justice in the end benefits others, not just ourselves. So We have to remember, too, that the government's job, right? So this is what Paul's reminding Festus is. The government's job, in Romans 13 says that the government is the servant of God, right? That he's to punish the evildoer and reward the righteous. So the government's job is to punish the evildoer, and the government's job is to protect the rights of its citizens. Our founders got this 100% correct when they said this, that governments are instituted among men to protect these rights. Right? The rights are not given to us by the government. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That these are God-given, and it's the government's job to protect those rights. And what this means that these rights are God-given is that the government is limited. Right? The government is not God. When we say that God will hold the governors and government to account, that naturally limits government. Because far too many people here today, even those who believe in God, but especially those who do not, treat the government as if it is the source of our rights, it is the source of our salvation, that it is our functional God, that it is the highest authority. Christians have throughout history recognized that the government is a derivative authority of God. It is not ultimate, and that naturally leads to what conservatives believe is a limited government, because the government is not ultimate, it is therefore limited and underneath the authority of God. So, we need to, as Christians, remember our God-given rights and be judicious and wise in protecting those and asserting those in the right circumstances. So, that's Acts chapter 25. I hope this is helpful and beneficial to you. Again, I want to remind you that I miss seeing you in class. I miss seeing you in church. Seeing you through the windshields on Sunday for the worship service is not ideal, but it's better than nothing. So I hope to see you guys on Sunday. Hope you're having a good week, and hopefully we'll see each other in real life soon enough.